Runners coming forward. Off and racing in the second division of the ITBA, sponsored 4-year-old mares Maiden. Heading away, She's a Fair Maid is going to be prominent early on in company with Sunset Vista as they make their way on past the post. 5 Shore Roses next, and they in turn are being tracked by Puppies in July, who's been followed next up in the field by Savannah Breeze, and behind Savannah Breeze races Spring Waltz, with next up and behind these Lola de Bambus. Further back to Glitz and Glamour, and last of all in the earlier part of the race is Whiskey Fever as they make their way on down the hill into the bend that's going to take them around towards fence number 1, first of 3 fences in the back straight. And as they do so, She's a Fair Maid Connections took her opening contest, being followed towards the outside by Sunset Vista, and they in turn are being followed by 5 Shoros back in third. Next up and behind these then races Poppies in July, and they're being followed by Spring Waltz, and further back and behind them then to find the next one racing, which is Savannah Breeze. They go out of the first, which all have cleared safely. On touching down the overall back marker was Whiskey Fever as they make their way on through the gap and on towards fence number 2. And as they do so, up front with the advantage, it is down the inside She's a Fair Maid, towards the outside Sunset Vista. Back in third then behind these races 5 Shores, and they in turn have been followed over by Poppies in July, with next up and behind these Savannah Breeze, and they're being followed further back by Spring Waltz. Lola de Bambus is last but 2. They are Glitz and Glamour, and last of all is Whiskey Fever. Out over fence number 3 they go and make the climb up towards the highest point of the track, and it is She's a Fair Maid, the daughter of Crystal Ocean, who has the advantage, being followed back in second spot by Sunset Vista, the Affinity. Back in third behind these is another Crystal Ocean, 5 Shoros. They in turn are being followed next up in the field as they make the run that's going to take them around the bend downhill by Poppies in July, the daughter of Poet's Word. Next up and behind these then is Savannah Breeze, the Order of St. George filly, who in turn has been tracked further back in the field as they continue the downhill run by Spring Waltz, the Scirocco. Lola de Bambus, the Mass Marvel, comes next. She's last but 2. They are Glitz and Glamour, who is a daughter of Walk in the Park, and last of all is Whiskey Fever, the Westerner. Making the way on now to go on towards their next fence, the fence before the winning post, and as they do so, it is She's a Fair Maid being followed in second spot by Sunset Vista towards the outside. Back in third behind these is 5 Shoros. They're being followed over by Poppies in July, with Savannah Breeze who comes next. Spring Waltz is towards the outside. Spot the Yellow Jacket towards the outside. They've been followed next up in the field by the Pink Jacket down the inner of Lola de Bambus. They in turn have been followed by the Green and Gold of Glitz and Glamour. JP McManus looks familiar to all. Further back behind them then there's a few lengths for break to find Whiskey Fever in yellow and pink, who's last of all. Making their way down the hill, that's going to take them on their way towards fence number 6. They've completed their first circuit, and as they do so, it is She's a Fair Maid from Sunset Vista in second spot. Back in third behind these is 5 Shoros, and they in turn have been followed next in the field by Poppies in July, who's been tracked as they make their way on by Spring Waltz. Savannah Breeze comes next in the 5th position, and they in turn have been followed back in 7th then by the next one racing, which is Lola de Bambus as they go out of that one. Glitz and Glamour is last but 1, and last of all continues to be Whiskey Fever, who was the subject of strong market support on her last start at Ballyragget. Making their way through the gap on their way towards fence number 7, and as they do so, it is She's a Fair Maid with Sunset Vista for company. Back in third behind these there's a line of 3. 5 Shoros out wide. In the centre of the track then races Poppies in July, and they in turn are being chased next up in the field by the Black Jacket of Savannah Breeze as they go out over that one. Further back and behind them as they make their way on up towards the highest point of the track races Lola de Bambus with Spring Waltz, Glitz and Glamour, and last of all is Whiskey Fever. Rounding the top bend at the highest point of the track, and they'll shortly be turning left-handed and making their way back down the hill into the home straight, and as they do so, it is She's a Fair Maid being tracked towards the outside by that Sunset Vista. Between them goes 5 Shoros as they continue on the downhill run. Further back and behind them to find Poppies in July, and then Spring Waltz, and they're being followed by Savannah Breeze as they go out over the fence to the penultimate fence in the circuit's time, where there was a mistake by Sunset Vista as they head on now to make their way on towards the fence that were their last in the circuit's time. She's a Fair Maid from Sunset Vista between horses. 5 Shores out a little wider in the blue jacket. Poppies in July, it comes next in red and yellow colours. They in turn are being followed over by Spring Waltz. Poppies in July hit that hard. Next up and behind these races Savannah Breeze, and they in turn have been tracked by Glitz and Glamour. Pure slaps down the shoulder there for Lola de Bambus, and last of all continues to be Whiskey Fever. She's always been in rear. Making their way out the country for the final time in the second division of the ITBA, sponsored 4-year-old mares Maiden. They have 5 fences and all left to be jumped, and it's She's a Fair Maid from Sunset Vista. They've been 1-2 throughout. The in turn are being followed back in third by 5 Shoros. There's a few lengths or a break then to find Spring Waltz, who in turn has been tracked by Poppies in July as they make their way on around the bend into the back straight on their way towards the fence that is 5 from the finish. And as they do so, it is She's a Fair Maid from Sunset Vista in the centre of the track, out a little wider to 5 Shoros as the race on towards 5 out. Over in front, She's a Fair Maid touchdown with the advantage. 5 Shoros in second. Down the inside in third continues to be She's a Fair Maid towards the outside then as they make their way on. Between them is Sunset Vista as they make their way on now towards the 4th last fence, and it is She's a Fair Maid with Sunset Vista in the centre of the track. 5 Shoros out a little wider. They in turn are being followed next in the field by Spring Waltz, who comes next, and further back and behind them then to find the next one racing, which is Whiskey Fever, as they continue on their way. We lost one along the way, try to pick that up as we continue, making their way around their top bend now at the top of the track. The one to depart was Savannah Breeze as they continue down and make their way around the bend at the highest point, and as they do so, up front with the advantage, it's close to call. There's a line of 3 down the inside. She's a Fair Maid, 5 Euros out wider, and in between them is Sunset Vista. They in turn are being followed back in the field in third by Spring Waltz, and further back behind these then to Poppies in July, who in turn has been chased downhill by the next one racing, which is Whiskey Fever, racing on towards the second last fence. Over in front, She's a Fair Maid touches down with the advantage. 5 Shoros was in third when crashing out. Also coming down there when held at the time was Spring Waltz, hampered Whiskey Fever, racing on towards the final fence, and She's a Fair Maid who's got the advantage to the last by a couple of lengths to Sunset Vista over the far side. They go to the final one. She's a Fair Maid from Sunset Vista. Precious little to choose between the two mares. They go inside the closing stages. She's a Fair Maid is all out and is holding onto the advantage grimly. She's a Fair Maid got there. She's a Fair Maid beat Sunset Vista back in third behind these. They were followed in by Poppies in July, then came Glitz and Glamour, and further back in behind them to find Whiskey Fever, looking back down to the second last fence. Glad to report Rob James and his mount to his feet. Same can be said for Jack Hendrick and his mount.